Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel, and today I wanted to carry on with my reviews of books that have been longlisted for this year's Booker Prize and what they're kind of all about, really. And so we've got this book here, Ledia Xhoga with Misinterpretation. And this book was one that I didn't really know a great deal about going into and really pleasantly enjoyed. I will talk a bit about some spoilers later, but for the most part I'm going to try and keep it spoiler free. And with that in mind, let's get talking a bit about this book. So the plot of this book. So we have our narrator who is working as an interpreter between English and Albanian in New York City. And the Albanianness of this is very important to the book, because essentially a large part of this is about thinking about history and particularly putting both the US and Albania kind of often in opposition to each other in terms of how lives could be very different in either place. And so what we see at the beginning of this book is she is asked to be an interpreter for a man called Alfred, who is dealing with some quite intense and quite tricky and complex trauma. He is in therapy, and she is the one interpreting those therapy sessions, or at least is meant to be. And right at the beginning we see how she does the first session and immediately realizes that her life is too interwoven with his. The things that he's talking about, she realizes hit her a bit too personally for her to be able to do this effectively. So she is let go from that role quite quickly. But what that really sets up in this book is the way that she in some ways can't escape an Albanianness around her. And I mean that in the sense of the sort of echoes of history or the echoes of various other things going on in this book. And that's what I think is really interesting about the way this book functions. So for the most part, we meet lots of characters through her who often are in the US and are trying to jump through the various loopholes and the various things needed to be citizens in the US. So that could be her interpreting for them when they go to various appointments. It could be like with Alfred, that she's helping him with the therapy session. But quite often their lives become far bigger, and the things they need from her become far bigger than what she's able to do solely as an interpreter. And we see this often through the book with her husband, Billy, who is... he sort of seemingly becomes more and more frustrated with her as things go on, because we keep on seeing how her sense of boundaries about any of this just completely evaporate. So somebody needs her to do something, she does it. There's somebody needs somewhere to stay, they're crashing at her place. And there is something set up there that is a little bit about almost an idea of a clash of cultures, that in the US it might be seen as quite not that normal to have somebody who you work with or you're helping in some professional capacity also to stay over with you. But there's a sense where, for our narrator, she feels a strong sense of having to do this, to look after these people, because in many ways they are, as she sees it, her people, and she wants to be able to extend this chance for them to have something good and to be able to be looked after, but often at a personal cost. We see this regularly throughout the book, and this isn't a spoiler, but just regularly, that she overexerts herself to give them something. And particularly we see that in the beginning of the book with Alfred, where even though she says to him, look, when I'm not allowed to be your interpreter anymore for this job, I'm meant to be having a break from being an interpreter, she still immediately tries to set up an appointment to meet up with him. And this often starts to become quite misconstrued for various things within the book, where it's often seen that she is being too permissive, perhaps, or maybe accidentally giving people the wrong impression about various things because of how willing she is to move her own goalposts and her own boundaries to allow these things to happen. And there's a sense wrapped up in it, I think, at least how I interpreted it, that this is also a link to some kind of guilt or trauma or something else, that she feels a sense that she cannot abandon people who are from Albania. She feels that there's something there that she must honour, often at the expense of her marriage, where we see early on in the book, and this is mentioned in the blurb, so it's not a spoiler, but that Billy becomes increasingly frustrated at her her putting everybody else first apart from herself and Billy. And so therefore it's just a very difficult situation for them both. That kind of covers the main initial part of where this book starts, but I think it does some other really interesting things, part of which I'll talk about in the spoilers. But something I found really interesting about the way this book does things is just about this experience of being in a new place and trying to adapt to that place. And the fact that the US feels constantly like this impermeable thing. No matter what the people around her are doing, there is another hurdle that they have to jump over. There's a piece of documentation they need. There's an appointment they have to make. There's some kind of thing that they need, and it is not doable. It's not achievable in some capacity. But what really starts to set up in this book is this becomes almost a thriller in a really dark sense, because we start to see how some of the things that are cropping up for our main character are far more dangerous and far more pernicious than just sort of going about and doing appointments. And this is where I think the book does something quite interesting, because we are obviously also reading a book that is originally written in English, and we are reading about someone who is constantly interpreting the language and Albanian identities into a sort of US English version. She's always finding some way to help them adapt or help shift the way that these things are happening, but often in a way that means that she herself feels somewhat alienated and isolated. And I think there's something interesting going on there with the idea of this being a book written in English that is then not translated from Albanian. This is a book that is presented to us in the kind of where the interpreter would be able to do, but actually would also in its own way be inaccessible initially to the Albanian characters in the book. There's something there, I think, about also the ways that there are things that are locked out from them. I may be thinking too much into that point, but it's something I found interesting. And so I just think this is a really interesting book, and one that I really enjoyed for the kind of energy of it. There's something very tense and very dramatic about large parts of this, but then there are these little subtle scenes of something else happening that I thought was so well done, and were really interesting. So yeah, this book keeps on following that trajectory, and I have to go into spoilers to talk about some parts of this, but I think it's a really interesting book, and I really appreciate what this book is doing, that it feels like it has an eye on the past and on echoes of history, but is also written in a way that moves away from some of the typical tropes of that. It doesn't feel like we're just, there isn't a side chapter that goes into the 40s and talks about history. It's all done through modern living history, the kind of things that the characters are carrying with them at that moment. They don't necessarily reflect back and say exactly what happened 10, 20 years ago. They just live with it. And that's something I found really interesting about the way the book's done. So yeah, if you do need to drop off here, feel free. But I'm going to go into talking about some spoilers. If you do need to drop off, thank you for joining. Bye-bye. But if not, I'm going to go into some spoilers now. So one plot point that I really wanted to talk about, because it's so pivotal to the whole book, but also is something that is really difficult to talk about without spoilers, is a character who she meets throughout the book who suddenly becomes this really tricky man for her. I think he's called Razan, and he essentially, early on, we see him as being this quite tricky character because he is following a woman called Layla. He is in a relationship, there's a sort of relationship there, it's a very tricky one, and he is following her around, and our character starts following him to sort of teach him a bit of his own medicine, give him a taste of his own medicine, but also to try to stop him in some way. And this then leads to this really odd situation where he is both this incredibly menacing figure and is somewhat convinced that they have some kind of relationship potentially. And so he starts to start following her basically around. And what comes from that is this really horrible and tense thing that really sort of seeps through in every page, of her being worried about her safety and Layla's safety, because she just wants to make sure that they're all safe in what could be an incredibly dangerous and violent situation. He has shown several times in the book that he is able to be quite menacing and quite horrible. And so there's a sense as this book goes along that he could do something quite dangerous. We don't really know until the end of the book whether or not that's going to come to pass. And that's what's so dangerous in this book, is it's never quite resolved. This book doesn't end with a big sort of walking out into the sunset kind of moment where everyone's fine. There's a sense that we're still somewhat wounded at the end of this book, which in itself feels like it echoes that theme of the book, of the sort of echoes of history and the wounds we carry. So that's something I thought was interesting in and of itself, and I thought was really well done in terms of the the tension of it all, because I found it utterly unbearable almost how tense it was at times when we think that this man might be able to do something quite horrible. But then something else comes up in the midst of that, which is about the relationship with Billy. And there's something that I thought was quite interesting where we essentially think that the relationship is potentially at its end. He says that he has some kind of work-based thing. He's a writer and also does some other bits, but he is off to spend 6 months writing about a bridge. And there's a sort of joke in the book almost about this, that this is an utterly wild use of time, but also in some ways again echoes this idea of history, that bridges, particularly in various parts of history, have had real moments. There is the set of people who are over there, there's the set of people this side of the bridge, and bridges are often destroyed as part of war. And there's a reference here around sort of a lot of history, and particularly sort of Eastern European history, that the book is getting at, I think. So there's this idea that for him, he can sit and write about a bridge, but the bridge for her always can feel like something slightly different. And she at one point is in Albania on holiday, well, sort of a holiday, seeing her family, and particularly to get away from a lot of this other drama. And she overhears a group of Albanian men talking about this American who is sat by a bridge and being paid to do so, and how ridiculous it is that there's money to do that. And she realizes it's Billy, and that this thus begins their sort of moment of reuniting. But what starts to come up in this is then quite interesting. They are brought together at their lowest ebbs, really, that he's sort of drifting and not quite sure what he's doing. He's grown out a beard and is in a foreign place, and in some ways he's having a great time, but also there's a sense that he is having almost a midlife crisis where he's maybe about to see his marriage end. Equally, she is at a low ebb and terrified about her future, and this is the moment that brings them together, this moment of utter crisis, and then knowing that they have to go back and solve the problem of everything that's happening with this really horrible man. And so the book then starts to go into a sense of what that could look like, for them to team back up, but potentially in a situation where the man who this really dangerous man is someone who our main character has pretended to be into and sort of had an almost date with, partly so that she could get his phone and destroy it, or partly so she could do these other things to stop him from harassing Layla. And so she knows that he at any point can bring this back on her. And this in many ways echoes some of the other experiences for some of the characters in the book. Almost every character who is some kind of immigrant to the US at some point speaks about the fear of that all being taken away from them, and the idea that essentially one call to ICE could end their stay there. But what that also starts to look like is something quite difficult. When we're looking at this horrible man, there is an Egyptian bodega owner who essentially says, oh, look, I'll try and talk to him and I'll try and see what's happening and try and get him away from you all. But then other people in the book regularly bring this up and say, well, you know, Zani's not really going to do anything because to do so would jeopardize his place in the US. And again, we see the risks of this for so many of the characters, that for them all they are is one phone call or one missed appointment or one bad document away from being denied a life in the US. And so any moment of terror can be amplified. So Layla is not as safe as she should be because her status in the US can also be challenged. potentially, or she can be threatened in other ways. This bodega owner can equally not do the right thing, because to do so could jeopardize himself. And our main character, is very, very aware of this throughout the book, and in some ways that seems to drive so much of this. And so in some ways this book does a lot of interesting things at subtly getting into those moments of what it might be like to be someone who's moved to the US, is maybe carrying some form of trauma from their previous place, and is now still in an incredibly precarious situation. It's not a sense of, the streets are paved with gold that is often spoken about for the US. It is a sense of, actually, at any point, you can still be stalked and harassed, you can still be unsafe, and this whole thing is built on sand in some ways. So yeah, I found all of that very interesting about the book, and I found it incredibly dynamic in the way that it's written. It just builds and builds to the point where you are genuinely quite terrified for some of these characters, I think, and I found that it really built it in an interesting way. So yeah, that's me talking about this book. I hope you have enjoyed it, if you've read it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this book as well. Take care, and speak to you all very soon. Bye bye.